Hello, beautiful people. My name is Kristen. Thank you for stopping by my channel. I have some reviews of books I have been reading, and the interesting thing is I picked them up for completely three separate unrelated reasons, and then they are so connected. I thought this is perfect to do a video not only reviewing these three books, but then talking even about how they're connected. So first up, I did a buddy read with Sandy and Mrs. Reads a Lot and her good friend Sonia, and we read Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. This is the true story of a young lawyer who goes through the process of opening up kind of a non-profit law firm that specializes on death row, about to receive capital punishment, or just unjustly prisoned. And one chapter he will talk about two or three people and a particular issue like mental health or motherhood, with young children passing and then being prosecuted for that, or several that are young men who are brought into it because of bad choices they make. And then every other chapter is the story of Walter McMillan, who was one of those young men that got brought into a situation just naively. He had had an affair with a white woman, and being a black man, that was not a good thing. He had a lovely family of his own, so that and alone was not a good choice. However, it's not a criminal choice to end up with a death penalty, but that stirred up enough people that really kind of targeted him and started framing him and misspeaking about him. And even though there was evidence that he did not commit this murder, it was completely framed on him. It was such a just gut-wrenching kind of story to read through and to see if Bryan can actually get him through it, and then what are the ramifications and the fallout from all of this. And I haven't seen the show yet, but there is a show documenting it as well. But it is just really, really well told, just with the way that it has these kind of systematic stories, and yet he puts a face to it and he says, here's an example of this, right? And so it really helps you understand. So really, really powerful just thinking about those issues. I had also read Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed. This came up in my mug pick. This I thought was actually going to be more about like a literary work about like literally the words that are involved in like slavery and abolitionists and those kind of things, but because that would be interesting too. If there's a book out there, let me know. But this was the story of Clint Smith actually visiting, this nonfiction story again, he's actually visiting a lot of sites for civil rights, the plantations, going to memorials, those kind of things, talking and interviewing people, saying what is specifically the story and the narrative told about slavery and its part, and also tracing that through history as we become a society that's more likely and more honest about talking about that part, and how do we have dialogue that includes the reality of that in our history in a way that's authentic and not so overwhelming to the fact of how horrendous it was. There's a point where you can become overwhelmed and shut down because something is too gruesome or horrific or unbelievable. And we don't want to do that. We want to be people that are able to wrestle with truth. It was fascinating because I have been to at least half of the 8 places that he had been to. And so that was fun, kind of having those memories or acknowledgments. And then what I most wanted to share about this, because he would do a beautiful job of talking about, like, say, the commercial side or the money-making side of, say, a plantation event, or even turning into an event center kind of thing. And then, like, what are the feelings or the deeper roots behind it, and how does that either honor or dishonor? And so it reminded me very much of a trip that I took my students on to South Dakota. We were going to Mount Rushmore, and then we went to Crazy Horse, and that was a huge contrast, right? Because you've got the government national site where, you know, you don't touch anything. There's literally barricades, and you'll be prosecuted if you take a blade of grass out. And then you go to Crazy Horse and they're like, here, take a stone off of the mountain as a souvenir free of charge, you know. And so those contrasts, right? But the most fascinating thing was I took them to Wind Cave National Park, which is just south of Crazy Horse if you're creating a South Dakota monument tour for your family. This was a lovely kind of cavern, not the most impressive cavern I've ever been to, but really a nice break, especially if it's hot, you know, because it gets much colder, you know, if you go into a cavern. So it's a nice break that way too. So anyway, before we go into the cave, we're standing up out in the field, and they're having us look at this hole in the ground that was supposedly the original hole that they discovered down into the cave. Then we're going to go around the corner and go into the actual entrance for tourism nowadays, right? We were out there for almost 30 full minutes standing in the sun, listening to the story of these two kind of boys who were like from pioneering families, playing, you know, how they discovered this hole, how they went into it, how, you know, this was passed and how people came back and blah, 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 blah. Okay, almost 30 minutes. She asked if there's any questions before we go in. So I raised my hand and I said, hey, we're a group, you know, from Virginia serving at the Rosebud Reservation. We've heard that Wind Cave is the center of the earth, you know, that this was the birth of man. Like, this is Genesis, right? This is the Garden of Eden. And she goes, oh yes, that is true. That is a really good story. Oh, it's too bad we don't have time to share that. What? We just spent almost 30 minutes talking about how a couple of white boys messing around found this hole, but it's the Genesis creation of an entire Lakota people, and you can't spare an extra 2 or 3 minutes to at least give me the origin story? I'm like, this sums up my frustration and my joy at a book like this about how the word is passed. We need the fullness of all the story. We need all the culture. We need to have both. I'm not saying don't tell me the story. I'm saying let's hear the full history. I'm all about the full history, y'all. And speaking of history, I have been a little bit on a history, you know, roll lately in my life. So for the summer, I had picked Rebel Yell by S.C. Gwynne. This is a kind of chunker-munker book about the life of Stonewall Jackson. When I lived in Virginia, was walking distance from my office to Stonewall Jackson's office, and most all of the places where the battles took place, I've been there multiple times. I know exactly what the train looks like. I, you know, ran a lot of the trails in the battlefields and the historic, you know, monuments around this area. And so it was even deeper meaning to me for why I wanted to read this account. And I learned so much. So it had been recommended to me by a historian friend that said, for good or bad, I really like how S.C. Gwynne writes this, where he allows you, the reader, to figure out if Stonewall Jackson was a good person or not, you know, what you think about him. It's very documented and a wide variety of stories and letters from his life about how he was so prayerful, about how he had these moments of severe kindness, severe humor, and yet he was just completely unafraid to do what he needed to do, which also at times was very ruthless. Just hard war kind of situations, right? A Civil War Southern general who was fighting for the rights of slavery. So it's an interesting thing reading this book. It is exceedingly clever and has enough stories of humor that I even laughed a couple times out loud. I was moved, very much so. I would get very invested. The way he would tell battle scenes wasn't overly graphic, but it certainly got the point across of the atrocity of war. And then you would be sucked into hearing about certain historical characters, and we have so many of their letters and their documents that he recreates the actual events where I can really picture them in my mind and understand how certain things were, and the either fearfulness of that or the bravery and goodness of that. And I knew quite a bit about the Civil War, but this brought so much of it into the chronological correct time frame for me. It did a lot of giving me an understanding of the challenges, I should say, of how communications happened in that day. And it did reinforce that the main issue of the Civil War was over slavery, but it wasn't just in people's minds, like we're going to go fight for slavery, because a lot of people didn't own slaves, but they were still part of that culture. So it would be as if I was fighting for, the America of today with different American things that we do because we're American, and yet I don't do all those things, but it's the way of life that we are supporting and fighting for. And so you can't really separate or completely take out slavery from the way that the South was run, if that makes sense. So a lot of people were fighting for their families, fighting for their land, fighting for their way of life without owning slaves or without directly even dealing with slaves. But there's no doubt that that's what the issue or the way of life was about. And it was fascinating. Now I'm kind of transitioning into putting all this together. It's been fascinating reading about this and about how people think and process and try to justify, right, that life of slavery, which is horrid and incorrect. And coming up with these like this has Monticello in it, which is Virginia, which is, this. How do you reconcile how you tell the story of this and this? And I do think there's a place to honor Stonewall Jackson, to know about him. I think it's super important. He was very important in our history as the US. I think it's really important to know. And I agree with my friend that this is a very clear account of his things about him that were really beautiful and lovely and worthy, and still I think would be good and beautiful and lovely today. And the parts that you would go, he was wrong. Because we're all human and we all have parts that were good and we all have parts that really need to be called out as wrong. So then this, how we tell that history, and also Just Mercy in talking about how history then has influenced the presence. And this is talking even about reforming slavery into the incarceration system. How there's injustice. And this does a really good job of not just focusing on race, but even more so poverty, mental, disabilities, and other things that give people less value in society, give people less voice in society, and then they are the ones that have the fallout and get into situations where they really need some serious mercy. So what an incredible summer. I had another video I can link below about my middle grade and my light reading. I had some classics and some poetry and some things to be lighter, but what an incredible journey of learning and thought-provoking books and titles. Reading Just Mercy with Sandy and Sonia and hearing their thoughts and having people to wrestle through all of that was just a really powerful experience. And I'm really glad that the Holy Spirit put all that into my life right now to work on me and to develop those things and to be mindful of those things and to live my life with an appreciation and a compassion about those things. So, have you read any of these? Do you want to read any of these? Leave me a comment below. Always enjoy meeting you in the comments. Like and subscribe. Have a happy summer and happy reading. Take care, y'all.